Christmas is a celebration of something that's scientifically impossible should this concern Christians. Welcome to Sharpening Arrows, where we train teens to think biblically about life and politics. I'm your host, Victor Jakes. So glad you are joining us for a very special Christmas episode. And if you're watching on YouTube, youtube.com/@sharpeningarrows, youtube.com/@sharpeningarrows, you can see that I have gotten a Christmas makeover. The background is totally different. All right, no, I didn't get a Christmas makeover. I am on the road. I am very excited to be podcasting from my twin sister's house. And you know what that means. There aren't just 7 kids who could walk into the room. There are more, more than that, and a cat. So that's my pitch for YouTube. If you want to see me just embarrassed, go to YouTube, youtube.com/@sharpeningarrows. You can also see that I am continuing to show my love and dedication to my precious wife. My hair is still not as short as it should be. I suppose that season of my life is over until I just go bald, and then I'll go back to having short hair. All right, so this show is a little bit unique. If you are a regular listener, then you know we are going to walk through a current issue, and I encourage parents and preteens and teens to listen together, to actually stop the podcast, ask the questions, discuss them. Remember, parents, you are your child's most important teacher, and I hope this podcast helps you facilitate those discussions. All right, and I do want to encourage you to stay tuned for a little later in the episode. You will have just a bit more information on this special studio that I am broadcasting from. All right, we are going to talk about the Christmas story. Now, if you have grown up in church, if you've grown up in a Christian household, you know this story. You are probably so familiar with this story that it's just in the background. You know what happens. So before we actually get into the topic, which is about why science can't disprove the virgin birth, I want to have a little bit of intro into the Christmas story. And let's pause here for this first question. What makes a compelling story? Of all the books that you've read, what is something about those books that made it interesting? That's worth discussing. Now, there are several things that you would find in a great piece of literature. One of them would be interesting, compelling characters. You could have the writing itself makes a big difference. The dialogue between the characters, the foreshadowing of what's to come. But the biggest thing, the thing that every great story needs, is a conflict. It needs a problem. Now, think about your favorite book, think about your favorite series. You can almost certainly quickly identify the problem. What is the problem that the main character or main characters is trying to solve? Think about something like Lord of the Rings. There's epic battles, but there's also the Ring of Power. And how is Frodo and his allies going to destroy that? If you've ever read the Wingfeather Saga, incredible book, you've got the Fangs of Dang. You've got people turning into these sort of half humans, and they're controlling everything. That's a conflict. Think about the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Edmund betrays his siblings, and then later in the story, Aslan dies. That's a conflict. To have a compelling story, you have to have a significant conflict. And the most compelling stories have the most significant conflict. So here's another pause point. What is the greatest conflict you've ever read in a piece of literature? And parents, I encourage you to get into this discussion too. Think about it. Think about what books you've been reading, what books you've enjoyed. And the thing about a compelling conflict is that's not enough, is it? You have to have a compelling resolution. Because in The Lord of the Rings, I'm going to try not to spoil it, so skip forward 2 minutes if you have not read the series, because it's an incredible series. You've got this conflict of Frodo on a mission to destroy the ring, and then the power of the ring gaining control over him. And Tolkien brilliantly resolves that conflict. It gives it a very satisfying resolution. Same thing with the Wingfeather Saga. Same thing with the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We know that the resolution in there is very satisfying. And in fact, when you see the resolution, you can go back through the book or through the series and say, I see it now. It all clicks into place. It all makes sense. All of these little nuggets that I overlooked. Oh, it was right there. Now, I'm going to answer my own question about the greatest conflict ever in a piece of literature. It's actually in the Bible. Because the story of Jesus' birth, life, death, and resurrection is simply as a piece of literature, whether or not you believe it true. It is the greatest story ever told because it has the highest stakes possible. Think about it. All of humanity faces eternal death and separation from God in hell. All of humanity. Not people from one country, not people from one part of the world, all of us. Not people from a certain time period, all of us throughout history. We have no hope of saving ourselves. God is righteous, and we have sinned. It wasn't just Adam and Eve. Sorry, teens. If Adam and Eve hadn't sinned, I would have sinned before you were born. Okay, we are all sinners, and if we're honest, we know that. We know that we deserve to spend an eternity in hell. But God, and just look for that phrase in the Bible, because those are the two greatest words in the Bible. There is a bad, impossible situation, but God. But God had a different plan. And if you go through the Old Testament, don't skip the Old Testament. If you go through the Old Testament, you will see previews, you will see foreshadows of this plan. In the Garden of Eden, right after Adam and Eve sin, God comes and he foreshadows his plan of redemption. The seed of the woman. The seed of the woman, that doesn't make biological sense, but boy, it's sure going to make biblical sense thousands of years later. You look at the Passover, the shedding of blood to protect his people. The Passover lamb having to be sacrificed to protect his people. You look at prophecies throughout the Old Testament, too numerous to list, but God is foreshadowing the plan, and that plan required an infinite righteous God to be born as a human baby to a virgin mother. Now, for someone who doesn't believe the Bible, who isn't a Christian, that's a major problem. Because that isn't scientifically possible. Now go back. Think about those great pieces of literature. Think about The Lord of the Rings. How do we know The Lord of the Rings is a story and not a history book? Well, there are no hobbits. Middle-earth doesn't exist. Right? It's a created world. Go to the Wingfeather Saga. How do we know that the Wingfeather Saga is a work of fiction? There are no fangs running around. Go to Narnia. How do we know Narnia is a work of fiction? There are no talking magical beast. Right? And so someone who doesn't believe in the Bible can say, yeah, I appreciate the story. I appreciate the stakes in the Bible. But when you have a faulty premise, a false premise, a premise that can't possibly be true, well, you can spin any story you want. Now, before we continue, I want to tell you about a different story. A story from my friend Jonathan Lindstrom, who has just released his debut novel, Memory Burn. It is a terrific sci-fi adventure story. It's set in a dystopian future where AI definitely hasn't improved the world. That's the conflict we're talking about, right? We've got the memorable characters, we've got the action, we've got the adventure, we have the conflict. Jonathan's book, Memory Burn, is right there. It has intense action sequences and memorable characters. I do have to give you fair warning. The plot twist will keep you up late as the characters chase freedom and their memories. Now, the executive producer of this podcast, my beautiful daughter, has been engrossed in this novel, and she even gave it the highest praise a teenager possibly could. She was reading the novel instead of doom scrolling on some device. So go to Amazon.com, look up Memory Burn. It's a book, Memory Burn book, and get it for yourself. Or if you are needing a last minute Christmas gift or a New Year's gift, order Memory Burn. You will not regret it. All right, so we've got the skeptics who say, okay, the Bible, Christmas, the coming of Jesus, that's a nice story. That's actually even a compelling story as a piece of literature. But we know it couldn't possibly have been true because it's not possible for a virgin to give birth. Now, if you were familiar with this podcast, thank you for your continued listenership, but you know that we're going to start with arguments for the wrong side, the side that I personally disagree with. We're going to make the best arguments for that side that we can, and then we're going to go through and refute those arguments. All right, so argument number 1 against the virgin birth. Actually, let's have a pause point. What do you think the strongest argument is against the virgin birth? Now, remember, if you want to debate like Charlie Kirk did, if you want to ask questions like Allie Beth Stuckey, you can't just know the right side. You have to know the wrong side. And there's no better way to really dig into a side that you disagree with than to make the argument for it. Then you can see its strengths, its weaknesses. And of course, we remember, we've talked about it a lot in this podcast, there are appealing arguments for wrong ideas. And it's a mistake to think that there aren't. All right, so argument number 1, against the possibility of virgin birth. Simple. It's not physically possible. I'm not going to go into a biology lesson here, but it's not physically possible. Think about a magician. I remember watching some magician on TV decades ago. I'm old. And I think it was a spaceship. Something. He made it disappear, right? That was the thing. And we were watching on the TV, and we recorded it, and we were rewinding it and playing it and trying to figure out, how did this happen? Because what we knew didn't happen is that it actually disappeared. We knew that wasn't physically possible. And because we knew it wasn't physically possible, we were trying to figure out what the trick was. How did they do it? Now, I didn't figure it out. I didn't know how the trick was performed, but I knew it was a trick because I knew if it's not physically possible, then it didn't actually happen, even if it appeared that it did. And this leads us to the second argument, which is kind of a bigger picture version of this first argument, is that things that aren't scientifically possible are impossible. That's what it is, right? We have a reality. We have science that allows us to study that reality. And if someone says the apple fell from the tree and it fell up, I would say, no, it didn't fall up because gravity exists, right? We have all this scientific evidence for gravity. And so the apple is going to fall down. Now, I'm sure in your home, your floors are always picked up. I'm sure that the teenagers in your home always keep their rooms clean. But in my home, things sometimes get a little messy. Just being honest here. And if my kids attempt to blame, oh, it was the unit, the too tired, I can't think of the word. It was the little green men. They came through and they messed it up. I would say no. See, there are no little green men, leprechauns. There are no leprechauns. They didn't make the mess. You did. Things that aren't scientifically possible don't happen. You have to take responsibility for your own mess. Now, I'm sure that's never happened in your house, so you just have to imagine with me if that would happen. But if that would happen, I'm guessing your parents would have a similar response. No, that's not scientifically possible. And so I know it didn't happen. Well, a virgin birth is not scientifically possible. Therefore, we know it didn't happen. All right, before we get to the responses to those arguments, I want to tell you about Mama Bear Prayers, a podcast for moms who are knee deep in dishes and training their teens. Whether you are in the carpool lane or the coffee line, host Charity Rios wants to come alongside you and help you grow deeper in your relationship with Jesus. And this is why you don't skip the ads, because the room that I am in is actually the studio of Charity Rios. And Charity Rios, once upon a time, was Charity Jake's, and she's my incredible twin sister. That's right, she's not just my sister, she's my twin sister. And of course, we've always been close because we were womb mates. All right, I'm a dad now. I can tell those jokes. I always groaned when my dad would tell that joke, and now I think it's hilarious. I'm not even going to explain it to you. Womb mates, it's a great joke. But let me just tell you that if you need encouragement, especially if you are a mom, Charity Rios' podcast, Mama Bear Prayers, is the place to go. This podcast that you're listening to now, Sharpening Arrows, would not exist without Charity Rios' encouragement and her technical knowledge kind of pointed me in the direction of how in the world you record this. So what you're hearing from Charity is not fake. It's not for show. Take it from someone who's known her from the womb. Charity is an incredible wife and mom, great sister, and an encouraging person who depends on the Lord and encourages you in the Lord. So if you are a mom and you have not taken my advice to listen to Mama Bear Prayers, you are missing out. Come be encouraged on this journey of raising kids. All right, so let's have a pause point. Let's ask, which of the great 8 questions applies here? If you had a friend who was a non-believer or a skeptic or just wondering, or maybe you yourself have had these questions, and you have to remember, teens, it is okay. It is natural to have questions like this. Now, the problem comes in when you say, well, I have a question, therefore everything I've been taught is wrong, or I have a question and my parents believe this, I don't want to believe this. No, those aren't cutting the logic mustard, right? But it is natural to have questions. And so don't feel like you're sinning because you're having questions. The Lord gave you a brain, and it is good to use your brain. All right, and that's why we have these grade 8 questions, right? Because when we come across an argument we haven't heard before, we want to have tools in our mental toolbox to figure out what's true. Question 1, what happens next? Question 2, has this been tried before? Question 3, is there a principle involved? Question 4, what are the trade-offs? Question 5, what do you mean by that? Question 6, is this an appeal to emotion or logic? Question 7, am I focused on the speaker or the argument? Question 8, what does the Bible say? And remember, if I pick a different question, that doesn't mean your question was wrong. There are lots of different ways to approach arguments. But I want us to understand the appeal of this argument, the idea that, well, virgin birth isn't physically possible, therefore it didn't happen. Because we can go to this list, right? And it actually is going to check a lot of these boxes. Has this been tried before? Yes. Billions of times, right? We know virgin births aren't possible. Is this an appeal to emotion or logic? Well, it's very much an appeal to logic, right? We're saying there is a biological process. The biological process didn't happen. Therefore, the result didn't happen. And we can't just go to question 8 when we're talking to someone who doesn't believe in the authority of the Bible. So we can't just say, well, it's in the Bible. That proves it. If someone doesn't accept the authority of the Bible, then it doesn't prove it. All right, so I just want to point something out when someone says, well, a virgin birth isn't physically possible. You don't have to be a skeptic to wonder this. After the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary and told her she would give birth to God's son, Let's have a pause point. What did she say next? Did she fall down in worship at this incredible honor that she had been given? Did she celebrate that the Messiah was coming? No. She asked the obvious question. How will this be? Mary asked the angel, since I am a virgin. Okay, so again, when we talk about using your mind, God does not want you to turn off your mind. Okay, Mary did not turn off her mind. How will this be? Mary asked the angel, since I'm a virgin. And if you remember what the angel said, he said, God's going to do it. And then Mary had the appropriate response, and I don't have it in front of me, something to the effect of, I am the Lord's servant. I will obey. All right, so we actually are going to agree that the virgin birth is not physically possible. Okay, whoa. Does that mean it didn't happen? No, because the disagreement is actually going to come in this second argument that things that aren't scientifically possible aren't true. Again, I want to recognize the appeal of this argument because very often that is true. You remember the leprechauns who run through my house and make the mess? I know that's actually not happening because it's not scientifically possible. But, and here's the distinction. Here's question 3. Here's the principle involved. What is science the study of? Let's have a pause point. What is science the study? Think about that. Think about that as we go into arguments for the correct side, okay? In refuting the argument that things that aren't scientifically possible aren't true, I'm actually going to make the argument that the virgin birth is possible. And I think it will connect in there without me making it an explicit connection. So let's have another pause point. Do non-Christians believe things that aren't proved scientifically? What do you think? Well, if we're a Christian, then we know that's definitely true because the virgin birth we've already talked about is not physically possible and we believe it. But do non-Christians believe things that aren't proved scientifically? All right, this is a kind of a deep question. We're getting a little philosophical here. All right, argument number 1 in defense of the virgin birth, or the fact that science can't disprove the virgin birth. We need to understand the limits of science. Modern culture has elevated science. It's become sort of the queen of all the disciplines. It's the source of agreed upon truth. I don't know if you remember during COVID. Trust the science! But we have to understand something. Science isn't the only source of truth. You know that it's wrong to murder a 3-year-old, but good luck finding a scientific basis for morality. Science can tell you how an organism lives or dies, but it can't assign meaning to that organism. It can't tell you why a human being is different, fundamentally different than another type of animal. Why we give greater penalties as a society for the murder of a human being than the murder of a dog. That's based on morality, and morality simply doesn't have a scientific basis, it has a theological basis. But it's not just morality. Quick, ask your parents when their anniversary is. Ask your parents when you were born. Ask your parents when the Declaration of Independence was signed. Did you run an experiment to find any of those dates? Did you create a hypothesis for them? Of course not, because history is another source of truth. And so we have to understand in our modern culture, in the secular world, science has been elevated as kind of the premium or the only sometimes source of truth, and that's simply not true. There are other sources of truth, leaving aside whether or not you believe the Bible. There are other sources of truth, and we need to establish that. All right, that leads us to the second argument for why science can't disprove the virgin birth. And this goes back to that pause point we had. which is what is science the study of? Science is the study of the natural world. Now, this is very important. We all enjoy the technological advances that have come from applying scientific knowledge. My word, we're listening to a podcast or you're watching on YouTube, youtube.com/@sharpening-arrows. How'd you like that? Right? But none of this is possible without the application of scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge is great. It's tremendous. It's wonderful. But miracles, like Jesus' conception, like the virgin birth, are supernatural events. By definition, they violate the laws of nature. Now, for a Christian, this isn't a contradiction because an eternal, all-powerful God isn't bound by the natural laws that he created. Of course, he can step into the universe he created and do something that we cannot. He is God. And of course, science can't prove this because science is the study of the natural world, and miracles are things that are supernatural, things that go against what is normal. That's why they're miracles. If virgin births happened all the time, it wouldn't be a miracle. Now, what this is like is it's like, imagine someone is colorblind and they say, I can't see color. Therefore, color doesn't exist. Well, we recognize a problem, right? Well, you can see the world, but you're missing this thing, and it's not your fault because it's not something that you can see. It's not the fault of science that it can't see the supernatural because that's not what it's studying. It's studying the natural world, not the supernatural world. Now, I want to be clear on this. Accepting that miracles are beyond the realm of science does not prove the virgin birth occurred. Okay? What we have shown is that science cannot disprove the virgin birth because science, by its very nature, can't prove or you could say it could prove if you had certain situations, right? But it can't disprove a miracle because it can only study the natural world. And so we have to look to other sources of truth to determine the validity of the Bible, the validity of Jesus's life, death, burial, and resurrection. And I'm not going to get into those because I'm approaching a half hour. But I would just like to note there is substantial historical evidence for Jesus' life and resurrection. And so our faith is not blind. It is based on strong evidence. All right, let's have a final pause point. What do you think about this? Do you feel like you have a better understanding of the limits of science and the connection between science and miracles? Now, when a skeptic objects to Christmas because the virgin birth isn't possible, feel confident to remind them that that's the whole point. Now, Merry Christmas. I hope you have a wonderful week, a wonderful time with family, with friends. As a small gift to me, would you please send a text message to a friend that you think would enjoy this show and let them train their teen along with us. Merry Christmas. Be courageous like Charlie. Stay sharp and give God the glory. I'll see you next time.